Welcome to the RPTM podcast, the show that breaks down the myths of monolithic history and tells our story through multiple lenses. I'm your host, Professor Ryan Lancaster. Today's episode is partially underwritten by you, the listener. Find out ways to support the podcast on my website, ryanglancaster.com. Episode 2, Land Bridge, the Archaic, the Post-Archaic, and the White Myth. There is a common myth that lingers within the historical community. Every year I ask my students whether they enjoy history or not. Generally, I get a good mix of enjoyment juxtaposed with physical anguish. If I press further and see why they hate studying history, the overwhelming answer is that history never changes. It's boring. Well, I'm here to put that baby to bed with rule number 2 of history. History is always changing. If we were to receive all our information from a textbook written 30 years ago, then yes, history doesn't change. But as we discover more artifacts buried in mountainsides, or we invite more perspectives to the table, much like the 1619 Project, history becomes a tad more elastic. Case in point, as of the week of me writing up this podcast in 2020, a newly revealed discovery is challenging the established narrative. According to new finds from Mexico, humans settled in the Americas much earlier than previously thought. They suggest people living there 33,000 years ago, twice the widely accepted age for the Americas' earliest settlement. The results are based on work at Chiquihuite Cave, a high-altitude rock shelter in central Mexico. The archaeologists found nearly 2,000 stone tools, suggesting people used the cave for at least 20,000 years. How did we get here? And this is not a philosophical quandary. I ask, how did people find their way to the land that would become the United States? During the second half of the 20th century, a consensus emerged among North American archaeologists that the Clovis people had been the first to reach the Americas about 11,500 years ago. The Clovis ancestors were thought to have crossed the land bridge linking Siberia to Alaska during the last ice age. This land bridge, known as Beringia, subsequently disappeared under water as the ice melted, and these big game hunters were thought to have contributed to the extinction of the megafauna. Large mammals such as mammoths, mastodons, and various bears roamed the region until the end of the last ice age. As the Clovis first idea took hold, reports of earlier human settlements were dismissed as unreliable, and archaeologists stopped looking for signs of earlier occupation. But in the 1970s, this orthodoxy started to be challenged. In the 1980s, substantial evidence for a 14,500-year-old human presence at Monteverde, Chile, emerged. And since the 2000s, other pre-Clovis sites have become widely accepted, including the 15,500-year-old Buttermilk Creek Complex in central Texas. As of July 2020, archaeologists have found evidence of human occupation stretching back far beyond that date at the Chiquihuite site in the central northern Mexican highlands. The team dug out a 10-foot deep stratigraphic section, a sequence of soil layers arranged in the order that they were deposited, and found some 1,900 stone artifacts made over thousands of years ago. Researchers were able to date bone, charcoal, and sediment associated with the stone tools, using 2 scientific dating methods. The first, radiocarbon dating, relies on how a radioactive form of the element carbon, or carbon-14, is known to decompose over time. The second, optically stimulated luminescence, or OSL, works by measuring the last time sediments were exposed to light, and the findings could lead scientists to take a fresh look at the controversial early occupation sites elsewhere in the Americas. Between 26,000 and 19,000 years ago, sea levels were low enough for people to cross easily from Siberia to America via the Beringian land bridge. And what about during earlier times? before 26,000 years ago, the latest data suggests that the Beringia might have been a rather unattractive place for humans. It might well have been wet and muddy and challenging to travel over. Historians still think the most likely scenario is for people to have come on a coastal route, hugging a coast, perhaps with maritime technology. While people seem to have been in the Americas before 26,000 years ago, they were probably thin on the ground. It's only much later, between 14,000 and 15,000 years ago, that populations increased substantially. It coincides with the temperature spike at the end of the last ice age, when jumps around 44 degrees are seen in just a short space of time. The scientists also used environmental DNA techniques to look at human genetic material in the cave sediments, but they could not find a strong enough signal. Previous DNA evidence has shown the Clovis people shared many similarities with modern Native Americans, and scientists will now want to understand how these older populations relate to later human groups who lived on the continent. The results reveal the signal of a human presence stretching back thousands of years before the Clovis people. I include all this knowledge because it is important to understand that this fledgling theory has potential to not age well. It may be a week from now, and it's all revealed to be a hoax. All those stone tools turned out to be just chicken bones. I mean, probably not, but still. Land bridge. Well, that was fun. But from here on out, we'll be looking at the historically agreed upon narrative of the first settlers to make it to North America. How accurate is this theory? Well, just imagine the shrugging person emoji, and that should give you an idea of how sure we are. It is believed that a small human population of at least a few thousand arrived in Beringia from eastern Siberia during the last glacial maximum before expanding into the settlements of the Americas sometime after 14,480 BCE. This would have occurred as the American glaciers blocking the way southward melted, but before the bridge was covered by the sea, roughly 9,000 BCE. Keep in mind, we're looking at these such large time frames that glaciers will be advancing and retreating several times. In the late Pleistocene, Beringia was a mosaic of biological communities. Beginning from 55,000 BCE, steppe tundra vegetation dominated large parts of Beringia with a rich diversity of grasses and herbs. There were patches of shrub tundra with isolated refugia of larch and spruce trees with birch and alder trees. It has been proposed that the largest and most diverse megafaunal community living in Beringia could only have been sustained in a highly diverse and productive environment. From 55,000 to 13,000 BCE, the climate was wetter and colder than the steppe tundra to the east and west, warming in parts of Beringia from 13,000 BCE. These changes provided the most likely explanation for mammal migrations after 13,000 BCE. The warming provided increased forage for browsers and mixed feeders. Beringia did not block the movement of most dry steppe-adapted large species such as antelope, woolly mammoths, and horses. However, from the west, the woolly rhino went no further east than the Anadyr River. From the east, North American camels, the short-faced bear, musk oxen, the American badger did not travel west. At the beginning of the Holocene, some mesic habitat-adapted species left the refugium and spread westward into what had become tundra-vegetated northern Asia and eastward into northern North America. But where do humans make their appearance? According to most generally accepted theory of the Americas settlement, migrations of humans from Eurasia to Americas took place via Beringia. the land bridge that connected the two continents across from what is now the Bering Strait. The number and composition of the migrations are still being debated. Falling sea levels associated with an intensive period of quaternary glaciation created by the Bering Land Bridge that joined Siberia to Alaska about 60 to 25,000 years ago. This latest migration could have taken place 12,000 years ago. The earliest remains undetermined. The Paleo-Indian or Lithic stage lasted from the first arrival of people in Americas until about 5,000 to 3,000 BCE, in North America at least. 3 major migrations occurred, as traced by linguistic and genetic data. The early Paleo-Americans soon spread throughout the Americas, diversifying into many hundreds of culturally distinct nations and tribes. By 8,000 BCE, the North American climates were very similar as they are today. The Clovis culture, a megafauna hunting culture, is primarily identified by using fluted spear points. Artifacts from this culture were first dug out in 1932 near Clovis, New Mexico. The Clovis culture ranged over much of North America and appeared in South America. The culture is identified by the distinctive Clovis point, a flake flint spear point with a notched flute, by which it inserted into a shaft. Dating of Clovis material has been associated with animal bones and using carbon dating methods. Recent re-examinations of Clovis materials using improved carbon dating methods produced results to roughly 9,000 to 8,000 BCE. Numerous Paleo-Indian cultures occupied North America, with some arrayed around the Great Plains and Great Lakes of the modern United States and Canada, and adjacent areas to the west and southwest. According to the oral histories of many of the America's indigenous peoples, they have been living on this continent since their beginning, described by a wide range of traditional creational stories. Other tribes have stories that retell migrations across long tracts of land and a great river believed to be the Mississippi River. Genetic and linguistic data collected shows the indigenous people of this continent with ancient Northeast Asians. The Folsom tradition was characterized using Folsom points as projectile tips and activities known from kill sites where slaughter and butchering of bison took place. Folsom tools were left behind between 9,000 BCE and 8,000 BCE. The Na-Dene speaking peoples entered North America starting around 8,000 BCE, reaching the Pacific Northwest by 5,000 BCE, and migrating along the Pacific coast and into the interior. Language experts, anthropologists, and archaeologists believe their ancestors made a separate migration into North America later than the first Paleo-Indians. They moved into Alaska and northern Canada, along the south of the Pacific coast, into the interior of Canada, and south to the Great Plains and the American Northwest. They were the earliest ancestors of historical Navajo and Apache. They constructed large multi-family dwellings in their villages, which they were used seasonally. People did not live there year-round, but for the summer, hunting and fishing and gathering food supplies for the winter. The Archaic period. Not much is known about the people that existed during the Archaic period, but much can be inferred. Archaic cultures are defined by a group of common characteristics rather than a particular time or location. In Mesoamerica, Archaic cultures existed from approximately 8,000 to 2,000 BCE, while some archaic cultures in the Great Basin of the Southwest began at about the same time but persisted well into the 19th century. The primary characteristic of archaic cultures is a change in subsistence and lifestyle. Their Paleo-Indian predecessors were highly nomadic, specialized hunters and gatherers who relied on a few species of wild plants and game. But archaic peoples lived in larger groups, were sedentary for part of the year, and partook of a highly varied diet that eventually included some cultivated foods. In these ways, archaic cultures in the Americas are somewhat similar to the Old World's Mesolithic cultures. The Ice Age came to an end quickly. Warmer climate encouraged the growth of new plants. Deciduous trees replaced spruce and pine, which continued to grow in more northern latitudes. Animals also changed their way of life, because most animals depend on plants for food. Ice Age mammals, such as the mastodon, became extinct, due in part probably to changes in the availability of food. They were unable to adjust to the new environment. With all these changes, Paleo-Indian people also had to change the way of life if they wanted to survive in this new world. The Archaic period was a time of change. Early Archaic people continued a hunting and gathering way of life. Still, they invented new tools to do so. Middle Archaic people were less nomadic. For at least part of the year, they lived in villages. Late Archaic people still hunted and gathered, but they also cultivated native plants to supplement their food supply. Archaic peoples used a wide variety of food sources and based many of their choices on seasonal availability. Food remains found at the archaeological sites include a range of mammals, including rabbits, antelope, deer, elk, moose, and bison, terrestrial and water birds, fish and shellfish, and plant foods such as tubers, roots, seeds, fruits, and nuts. Archaic peoples also created several tools not seen before in the Americas. Their use of new food sources and creation of new tool types probably developed in tandem, with innovations in each realm fostering additional developments in the other. Basketry and netting augmented the collection and storage of fresh plant foods, while grinding stones made hard seeds readily edible. Hunting was supplemented with the development of tanged and side-notched projectile points, birding and small game nets, and fish hooks. As a more reliable subsistence base allowed the congregation of larger groups, people became more sedentary and social complexity increased. In the late Archaic, people began to tend plants, albeit to a limited degree. In North America, Archaic peoples east of the Mississippi River focused on pigweed and related species. Simultaneously, groups in Mesoamerica worked with a wide variety of corn, and those in South America worked with wild potato species. However, Archaic peoples continued to rely upon hunting and gathering for most of their food. When a population begins to place greater emphasis on food production and its associated technologies, it is generally said they have developed into a woodland culture or a pre-classic or formative culture. A significant culture of the Archaic stage was the mound builders, who stretched from the Great Lakes to the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. Since the 1990s, archaeologists have explored and dated 11 Middle Archaic sites in present-day Louisiana and Florida, at which current cultures built complexes with multiple earthwork mounds. They were societies of hunter-gatherers rather than settled agriculturalists, believed necessary according to the theory of Neolithic revolution to sustain such large villages over long periods. Native American cultures are not included in characterizations of advanced Stone Age cultures as Neolithic. It's a category that more often includes only the cultures of Eurasia, Africa, and other regions. The prime example is Watson Brake in northern Louisiana, whose 11-mound complex is dated back to 3500 BCE, making it the oldest dated site in the Americas for such a complex construction. It is nearly 2,000 years older than Poverty Point site. Construction of the mounds went on for 500 years until it was abandoned from about 2800 BCE, probably due to changing environmental conditions. Poverty Point culture is a late Archaic archaeological culture that inhabited the lower Mississippi Valley and surrounded the Gulf Coast. The culture thrived from 2200 BCE to 700 BCE during the late Archaic period. This culture has been found at more than 100 sites, from the major complex at Poverty Point, Louisiana, across a 100-mile range to the Jaketown site near Bellinzone, Mississippi. Poverty Point is a 1 square mile complex of 6 major earthwork concentric rings, with additional platform mounds. Artifacts show the people traded with other Native Americans located from Georgia to the Great Lakes region. This is only one among numerous mound sites of complex indigenous cultures throughout the Mississippi and Ohio valleys. They were one of several succeeding cultures, often referred to as mound builders. The Oshara tradition people lived from 5500 BCE to 600 CE. They were part of the southwestern Archaic tradition centered in north-central New Mexico, in the San Juan Basin, the Rio Grande Valley, southern Colorado, and southeastern Utah. We will dive into this more a little later, and what it means actually for our history. The Post-Archaic. The Post-Archaic stages included the formative, classic, and post-classic stages. The formative stage lasted from about 1000 BCE to about 500 CE. The classic from about 500 CE to 1200 CE, while the post-classic refers to 1200 CE until the present day. It also includes the woodland period of North American pre-Columbian cultures, whose culture refers to the period from roughly 1000 BCE to 1000 CE in the eastern part of North America. Grave Creek Mound, located in Moundsville, West Virginia, is one of the most massive conical mounds in the United States. It was built by the Adena culture. The term woodland was coined in the 1930s and referred to prehistoric sites dated between the Archaic period and the Mississippian cultures. The Adena culture was a Native American culture that existed from 1000 BCE to 200 BCE, known as the early woodland period. The Adena culture refers to what was probably several related Native American societies sharing a burial complex and ceremonial system. The Hopewell tradition is the term for the common aspects of the woodland period culture that flourished along rivers in the eastern woodlands from 200 BCE to 500 CE. The Hopewell tradition was not a single culture or society, but a widely dispersed set of related populations connected by a shared network of trade routes, known as the Hopewell exchange system. At its greatest extent, the Hopewell exchange system ran from the southeastern woodlands into the northern shores of Lake Ontario. Within this area, societies participated in a high degree of exchange. Most activities were conducted along the waterways that served as the primary transportation routes. The Hopewell exchange system traded materials from all over North America. The period is marked by the increased use of flat-topped platform mounds arranged around central plazas, more complex political institutions, and a subsistence strategy still grounded in the eastern agricultural complex. While not technically in the continental United States, it would be folly not to mention the ancient cultures of Central America, including those at Teotihuacan. It is an ancient Mesoamerican city located 25 miles northeast of modern-day Mexico City. Teotihuacan is known today as the site of many of the most architecturally significant Mesoamerican pyramids built in the pre-Columbian Americas. It is the most essential and largest pre-Columbian city in Mexico. At its zenith, perhaps in the first half of the early millennia CE, Teotihuacan was the largest city in pre-Columbian Americas, with a population estimated at 125,000, or more, at least the sixth largest city in the world during its epoch. The early history of Teotihuacan is quite mysterious, and the origins of its founder is uncertain. Around 300 BCE, people of the central and southeastern areas of Mesoamerica began to gather into large settlements. Teotihuacan was the largest urban center of Mesoamerica before the Aztecs, almost 1,000 years before their epoch. The city was already in ruins by the time of the Aztecs. For many years, archaeologists believed it was built by the Toltec. This belief was based on colonial period texts, such as the Florentine Codex, which attributed the site to the Toltecs. In the late formative era, several urban centers arose in central Mexico. Scholars have speculated that a volcano's eruption may have prompted a mass immigration out of the Central Valley and into Teotihuacan Valley. These settlers may have found or accelerated the growth of Teotihuacan. Other scholars have put forth that the Totonac people as the founders of Teotihuacan. They have suggested that the city was a multi-ethnic state, since they find diverse cultural aspects connected to the Zapotec, Mixtec, and Maya peoples. The builders of Teotihuacan took advantage of the geography in the basin of Mexico. From the swampy ground, they constructed raised beds, called chinampas, creating high agricultural productivity despite old methods of cultivation. This allowed for the formation of channels and subsequently canoe traffic to transport food from farms into the city. The earliest buildings at Teotihuacan dated to about 200 BCE. The largest pyramid, the Pyramid of the Sun, was completed in 200 CE. The Pyramid of the Sun is the largest building at Teotihuacan and one of the largest in Mesoamerica. Found along the Avenue of the Dead, in between the Pyramid of the Moon and the Cicueta, and in the shadow of the mountain Cerro Gordo, the pyramid is part of a large complex in the heart of the city. The name Pyramid of the Sun comes from the Aztecs, who visited the city of Teotihuacan centuries after it was abandoned. The name given to the pyramid by the Teotihuacanos is unknown. It was constructed in two phases. The first phase was around 200 CE, brought the pyramid to nearly the size it is today. The second round of construction resulted in it being completed of a size of 738 feet across and 246 feet high, making it the third largest pyramid in the world, though still just over half the height of the Great Pyramid of Giza. The second phase also saw construction of an altar atop the pyramid, which has not survived into modern times. Over the structure, the ancient Teotihuacanos finished their pyramid with lime plaster imported from surrounding areas. They painted brilliantly colored murals. While the pyramid has endured for centuries, the paint and plaster have not, and are no longer visible. Jaguar heads and paws, stars, and snakes' rattles are among a few images associated with the pyramid. It is thought that the pyramid venerated a deity within Teotihuacan society. However, with little evidence supporting this hypothesis. The destruction of the temple on top of the pyramid by both the deliberate and natural forces before the archaeological study of the site has prevented the identification of the pyramid with any deity. The monument was built on a carefully selected spot. It was possible to align it both with the prominent Cerro Gordo in the north and perpendicular directions to sunrises and sunsets on specific dates, recorded by several architectural orientations in Mesoamerica. The central part of the urban grid of Teotihuacan, including the Avenue of the Dead, reproduces the sun pyramid's direction. In contrast, the southern part exhibits a slightly different orientation. The pyramid was built over a man-made tunnel leading into a cave located 20 feet down beneath the center of the structure. Originally, this was believed to be an original formed lava tube and interpreted as possibly the place of Chicomastak, the site of human origin, according to Nahua legends. More recent excavations have suggested that the space is man-made and could have served as a royal tomb. Recent scientists have used muon detectors to try to find chambers within the interior of the pyramid. Still, substantial looting has prevented the discovery of a function of the rooms in Teotihuacan society. The White Myth. It's important to know the history of these amazing structures and the people that built them, because no matter what is created in life, there will always be someone to take credit, including white Europeans. The mounds became a source of fascination for future President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. His family home of Shadwell was built on property containing a mound he dubbed Indian Grave, one of 13 in the region. As a child, Jefferson witnessed local Monocans making pilgrimages to the site. As an adult, he wished to study it systematically. Jefferson's excavations led him to understand better how Monocans built mounds in stages over many years, layering graves upon graves. His observations became part of the only book-length work Jefferson published in his lifetime, Notes on the State of Virginia, which appeared in several versions in the 1780s. Jefferson sought to enhance popular understanding and appreciation of the mounds through scientific inquiry. Still, his work restated a consensus perspective of Europeans long before him. Indigenous Americans built the mounds of North America. Despite Jefferson, despite science, despite indigenous memory and actions, despite first-hand observations of European explorers, the popular narrative about the mounds soon shifted. After making a case for the early consensus, why would educated men at the highest levels of American and European science and government and society choose to argue that the mounds of the United States were not Native American constructions at all, but rather the work of ancient and white Europeans? One of the books that kicked off the movement was Travels in Upper Pennsylvania and the State of New York. It's authored by French-American J. Hector St. John de Croix. His version manufactures a new nation's new history, replacing fact with a myth of an ancient and lost white civilization that thrived in North America and left the mounds as proof. This story made the displacement of the natives a kind of full-circle homecoming for white Europeans, a just reclaiming of a continent from barbarians. Europe and Asia had their ancient peoples, and the United States needed people every bit their equals. Allegedly, ancient Europe had flourished with civilizations for thousands of ages. The lost race theory solved the problem in a single stroke. It excused the existence of savages as interlopers. It created a history for America as old as Europe's, with people as warlike as the Romans and as architecturally ambitious as the Egyptians. The myth grew. The soldier, physician, and banker James H. McCullough, for example, wrote Researches on America, with one version published before the War of 1812 and another afterward. In this fanciful book, McCullough took the scattered claims of an albino or white race that built entirely new prehistory for America, stretching from the foundations of most ancient India through a great race war whereby these ancient white people were destroyed and their superior culture hijacked by swarthy people. History is always changing, as we learned with rule number 2, but that is not always a good thing. You've been listening to the RPTM podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate us on whatever platform you're listening on. Join us again next week when we talk about the seen and unseen of U.S. history. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, for more information, check out the show notes on my website. The show was produced by me. Our editor is me. Written and researched by me. Music is Down South by Bliv Beats. I'm Ryan Lancaster, and this was the RPTM podcast.